Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Église Sainte-Thérèse in Yerson. So in the last weeks, we have seen a little bit about the Goldberg variations from the perspective of a world that existed before them, where I have tried to show a few things through pieces and through ideas that may have been in the whole ensemble of subconscious influences that made the Goldberg variations possible. Of course, such a thing is not an analysis. It is necessarily simply a kind of giving of historical context and of artistic context, which perhaps is in the end what I, as an interpreter, am here to do. So we looked at various classes of variations within the Goldbergs, and there is a structure which is quite clear of every third variation belonging to a certain type. And as I said last time at the end, the last variation, number 30, is not so much a part of the structure as being simply whatever. And indeed, it's called Quodlibet, or loosely translated, whatever you like. So let's look at this variation now. What it is basically the conglomeration of two folksy tunes. Well, the first one of them is probably the one that's most immediately catching and which we associate with this variation. Now, the second of them is actually treated in a more elaborate and possibly more interesting manner. It has two parts. Well, the lyrics of it go, if the mother had cooked the lyrics start, cabbage and root vegetables have driven me away. And the second part of it is, if the mother had cooked meat, perhaps I would have stayed longer. Now, the first part of this is treated in a canonic way. Well, there are quite a few obvious canons that can be found here. That's probably the most obvious one. It's also the first one that appears. Well, instead of trying to take you through this in a sort of excruciatingly slow way, let me just play you the variation and point out by volume, which is one of these great things that the modern piano can do, every time that this first part of the second tune appears, and show how it's put in combination with itself and with other things. Now, you will probably have heard that the second part of this cabbage and root vegetable tune shows up at the end of each of the halves. And it's what you could call a simple invertible counterpoint together with the first half of the tune. So we have and at the end of the second half, it's exactly inverted. So now comes, of course, the moment where I tell you that this kind of thing also appears in the repertoire of the English virginalists, right? Well, yes, I will point you to a piece by Thomas Morley. Well, it's not a piece, it's an exercise by Thomas Morley, which is serving as the conclusion of the first chapter of his book, A Plain and Easy Introduction to Practical Music. Well, this little piece is not plain, certainly not easy, and absolutely not practical. It has all sorts of complications in rhythm, in jumping around in pitch, and it's basically a crazy little bit of fun. Now, one thing that seems to have been associated with the idea of fun is indeed putting in snippets of popular tunes, much like Bach does in his Quodlibet. I think there's a certain description of a pastime being engaged in by musically minded people of that era and of that social milieu, consisting of taking certain musical themes or somehow arrangements of notes and trying to fit popular tunes onto them. And in this piece by Thomas Morley, there is one particular popular tune which seems to have been an absolute favorite to try to fit onto just about anything, because it shows up in this piece, it shows up in a so-called medley by John Bull, it shows up even in a hexachord fantasy by William Byrd, and it's Will You Walk the Woods So Wild? It's, of course, especially the beginning few notes which are so distinctive and which immediately recall this atmosphere of fun which is being expressed whenever it appears. Most of the time when one is trying to fit this onto some kind of tune, the easiest way to go about doing it is to simply play that very fast, because then it can fit entirely onto one note. If you imagine a drone on the F below, then you can always put this tune at whatever place you want. And that's exactly what happens in this piece by Thomas Morley. You will see the link below. So let me summarize. Now that we have gotten in some ways to the end of this first run-through of the Goldberg variations. Now, I think, suppose that we did not know who Johann Sebastian Bach was. Suppose we only had this piece of music, but we had a full knowledge of all the rest of the things that exist in music, just not the name Bach. I think we would be able to recognize that this was somebody who deeply loved and was steeped in the tradition of a certain kind of music. This certain kind of music has its origins in the years between 1500 and 1550 in England, and developed there and elsewhere, especially in the Netherlands and in the north of Germany, in the century following. Now, as it turns out, Bach is one of these composers about whom we, in fact, do not know so much in all that which concerns the mundane details of his biography, and also of many rather surprising omissions in what we know about his musical life. That's why, for example, dating his works is sometimes quite a difficult and sometimes impossible thing. Now, there's one anecdote about Bach as a young man, which says volumes. Of course, it is one of these anecdotes that I don't think we can ever prove to be definitely true. It concerns him playing the organ to the, at the time, old organist Reinken. And the latter told Bach, well, roughly paraphrasing, I had thought this art was dead, but I see that it lives on in you. I think this is a kind of motto which we now, given our modern era and our capacity to be able to see such a great breadth of historical music as it is, that we should take this motto as a basis for understanding this aspect of Bach's music, which up to now has been quite neglected. We think of Bach as being at the beginning of a tradition. That's because we belong to a tradition which was so inspired by Bach that we consider him to be the progenitor teacher of the tradition to which we belong. But of course, Bach could not have known what his music would become after him. He lived in a world, like we all do, where there was a present, there was a past, and there was the idea of a future. Some people liked very much to plunge themselves into the past. Some people preferred to distance themselves from it. I think Bach was one of those musicians who not only respected the past for being the past, but also saw himself as making bridges between that and his own world. So there we come full circle, just as the Goldberg variations themselves come so we come full circle, just as the Goldberg variations themselves come full circle with the reappearance of the aria, the first thing one hears at the very end. Now let me just note that this idea of cyclical construction in variation form is, of course, part of this heritage that I have tried to shed a little bit of light on. And in this sense, let me play for you the aria in the way I would play it if it were a final aria. Now, I remember that once I played this piece and somebody told me that they found slightly disconcerting that I played the last aria differently from the first aria. Well, yes, I agree that is a disconcerting thing, because the point of the whole thing is that it should be the same. But somehow, in order for it to seem the same, it cannot be the same. And that is probably a universal thing that music does for us. Music is a structure which loves repetition. Without repetition, music simply makes no sense. But the thing about repetition in music is that every time something repeats, something changes. Something changes in us, something changes in our relationship to that particular arrangement of notes, and especially in our relationship to time and to memory. And perhaps this is the most moving thing in an emotional sense, the most emotionally affecting thing that happens in a performance of the Goldberg variations. It is perhaps even something which the composer could not have predicted. My experience with composing is that very often the effects which end up being salient are not the effects that one intended when putting pen to paper. But of course, these effects that one intends when putting pen to paper are the matrix of the piece upon which everything else needs to be built. And this everything else is built by performance tradition. And thus, as a final word, I would like to express my gratitude to the performance tradition of Baroque music, of classical music, of piano music, of Bach's music, of the Goldberg variations, which allows us to see this work as we do now.